Hello and welcome to the AI Show, brought to you by Lenovo. I'm your host, Emily Barrett, and I'm thrilled to be your guide into the fascinating world of artificial intelligence. In each episode, we'll deep dive into the AI universe, exploring the latest innovations and the people behind them, and how these technologies are shaping our future. On this episode, we'll be joined by Dr. Clare Walsh, who I'll be discussing education and some ethics around AI with. So let's begin as we take you on our journey through the world of AI. So, Clare, it's lovely to meet you. Do you want to just start by introducing yourself, where you're from, a little bit about your background as well?
Yes, so I'm Clare Walsh. I am the Director of Education at the Institute of Analytics. We are a professional membership body for the data professions, for business analytics and data analytics. I started out in education. I worked as a teacher, I worked as an examiner, an exam writer, a course book author, and I was interested in assessment analytics and what we could do with AI and data science in the world of education. And so I retrained in computer science. And that's my field where I took my PhD.
Wow, so it certainly sounds like a really, really cool career evolution you've been on, which I imagine gives you a lot of practical experience in both how AI can be applied to education, but also the kind of gaps in the market that AI is currently opening up, and opportunities for new careers that people might be able to explore. So do you want to talk a little bit around what kind of career gaps you're seeing opening up in the market and what kind of training people need to be looking for to be able to make the most out of those opportunities?
I think the people who are coming next are going to have a very similar path to mine, where you have an interest and you have a need to understand the data that works with it, and then you learn and retrain in another field. And it is a little bit challenging because, success criteria, terminology, values often don't translate between these different fields, so it can be quite hard. But I think the gaps that we're going to see coming up in the future will be around certain roles that the machines are able to do better than the humans. Not the whole job, but in general, it's going to be aspects of that job that could be automated, or perhaps we could get better insights and make better decisions. And so what we're seeing, I think, in the future is a much broader spectrum of people who feel they don't belong in the world of AI. They feel that the world of computing belongs to someone else. Nevertheless, we would like them to get confident and be able to start owning it, moving into it and retraining and understanding how the machines are working.
And I think that's, a really, really good thing to be raising right now. As you say, if we're left with people who are feeling as though they are being excluded from, people are calling it an AI revolution. I mean, it is one way of looking at it, but this change in the way that we are working, and if we're left with a whole large group of people who feel like they're excluded from that, we're going to miss out on a lot of insight and input that we could otherwise be using in the field that has the potential to be incredibly valuable. So how would you advise people go about getting comfortable with AI? Are there any particular first steps you'd recommend people taking in order to do that, so that we can try and minimize that group of people?
So there's a lot of fear. There's a huge amount of fear at the moment, and I think the fear comes from a theoretical level. If you've heard of the idea of AI and you don't understand anything about it, then of course it's scary. When you talk about AI taking parts of your job, we think back to the Industrial Revolution, because that was our experience in the past. When we deindustrialized, whole jobs went, whole professions vanished. We're not really looking at a repeat of that. We're looking again at aspects of roles within jobs being replaced. And when you come down to an actual, I could get a machine to do this job for you, usually most people are quite happy to get rid of that role. It's not something that they enjoy. So when it actually comes down to something real, It's much more understandable and welcomed. And if I could get rid of that role and that responsibility, I've got all this time free for all these other amazing ideas I've never had time for. So I think the best thing to do if you are afraid at the moment is to get enrolled into just an absolute beginner's course, a theoretical AI course, so you can understand what these algorithms are, how they work, what kinds of roles they could do, what kinds of roles they absolutely cannot do. All of the machines that we have at the moment have an aspect of error. We can't avoid it. They're probability based. This is not like hardcore maths. This is probability. We think it's probably correct, but there's always a chance it's going to be wrong. And so that's why we need humans overseeing them. We need humans working alongside these machines with a plan for how we're going to deal with the error when it inevitably comes. And I think the next step is just really accept it's coming to the job that you're doing, and get yourself on one of these. There are plenty of courses out there. We offer them. Everybody offers them. Just the next step. And it is one step at a time to get along this pathway to a much, much better future.
Yeah, and I completely agree with what you're saying there around it taking out parts of people's jobs. So it's a role rather than a job as a whole that we're looking to replace here. And it does tend to be the tedious, repeatable things that, let's face it, I say none of us. There are people out there, I'm sure, who do enjoy the repetitive tasks. But actually, humans are much better doing other things, right? And applying our actual human skills to things that we are better at.
Yeah.
And letting machines do things that machines are really good at, because machines are good at that repetition. They are good at that pattern spotting, right? And humans have loads and loads of other skills that we can go out and we can use and we can capitalize on. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you when you say that, yes, okay, jobs might change going forwards, but there is definitely a human element left in everything out there, right? We're still going to very much need humans to do jobs. So the other thing I guess I wanted to talk about with the mention of AI becoming more everywhere, especially in the last year, we've seen this real explosion of AI excitement, right? Everybody's talking about it, whether it's, on the street or in boardrooms or just on a day-to-day basis. AI has become more ingrained in our everyday language and our everyday lives just because of how accessible some AI platforms made themselves last year. But as we see that explosion, obviously, there start to become some ethical boundaries that get a little bit fuzzy. And do you have any recommendations around how people grow their awareness of where things get a bit fuzzy and how they ensure, if they're looking at implementing AI in their businesses, how they stay well within those ethical blurry lines so that they're not in that blurry area?
It is a challenge. There are no simple, straightforward solutions. We don't really have the population at the moment trained in this. So when we think about the threat of AI, we also have to think about the creative side of it. And it's created this whole need for a whole new profession of people who can look at these machines with some knowledge. I think when they were very much in computer science laboratories at university, which tends to have a very specific, narrow population represented, we saw some of the earliest applications of the modern types of AI, the neural net AIs, just using the data that they found, and the data that they found reflected all the social, historical prejudices of society. And it just didn't occur to them that would happen and it would be highly undesirable. I think now that these AIs are leaving the computer laboratories and they're getting into the hands of people who are a little more nuanced. They're not just looking for, it all came through in the end and nothing broke down. They're looking in a far more nuanced way. I think that is ultimately the best solution. And I think for these companies, I think for a long time now, they have had to take these very young data scientists and say to them, we'd like you to do this, don't mess up. Because they're the only ones that understand the process. And it's a lot of responsibility for a 22, 23-year-old person. It's too much. And so I think we are developing now a new profession of AI auditing, of being able to look at an AI process and say, I think this is the risk. I think this is a good thing. This is not robust technically, socially, for whatever reason. Again, it's interdisciplinary, which is not an easy space to go into. But I think ultimately it's having those skilled staff ready and understanding the technology that you're working with. Even under something like the EU AI Act, there is no technology that's absolutely banned, but there are technologies in certain circumstances and certain uses where you do have to be considerably more cautious, and you have to have a very careful monitoring process set up. You have to make sure it's easy for people to report back when they've noticed a problem. And I think that's right. And I think that for companies who are afraid of introducing artificial intelligence, I would say go ahead with caution and make sure that you have a very robust monitoring process and that you're ready to listen to anybody who has feedback that says, I don't think this is fair.
That sounds like some really good advice there. It's that proceed with caution. Don't want to say to people, don't do it because it's too scary. But there is an element of caution that needs to be used here, because not all AI is created equal. Not all models are created equal. As you mentioned, the data sets that get used to train these models, there are some inequalities in some of the data sets. So it is really important to be working with people who can provide you with a rounded understanding of what it is you're trying to implement within your business, and the limitations of that as well, because we tend to think of AI being able to answer everything. And in fact, it can't. There are limitations as to what AI can and cannot do. Do you want to talk a little bit about where you see those limitations at the moment?
No, I think it's more about the opportunities, actually. I mean, last year it just went crazy. I got asked so many times, is AI going to kill us all? And it's on such a hypothetical level. We'll send Dwayne Johnson. I think we'll be fine. How do you begin to address that? And I've had to think a lot about this and what my response to this is, because there are some genuine concerns that these machines are escalating at a speed that we honestly, nobody anticipated them being this creative this soon. If you'd gone back to 2016, even 2017 or 18, we'd have said, no, machines repeat, they can't create. And we got that wrong. But nevertheless, my conclusion is the more good AIs we put out there, the better. And there are some bad AIs and there are some limitations. And we do need these people who can look at them, anticipate the unanticipated consequences. But when we look at the positive impact of AI, if we look at things like healthcare, I mean, it's going to save your life. And that's a good thing. We haven't had a new antibiotic in my lifetime. Or I think we had one in the 1980s. That's a long wait. And yet now a machine can sift through all the million compounds and identify a short list, and we have one because an AI got involved in that initial sifting. And we have an environmental crisis we have to save. I'm pretty sure it's an AI that's going to save us. And so on balance, my conclusion is there will always be some bad actors. There will always be some mistakes made. We have to be ready to identify those as quickly as possible and correct them and take the appropriate corrective action. But on balance, the more good AIs we can put out there in the world, the more chance we have of solving the very profound problems that we face today. And so I am overwhelmingly optimistic about the use of AI.
And I think as soon as you start delving into this area, as soon as you start delving into AI a little bit, that fear does get eroded away, and it does get replaced with a lot of optimism, because, as you say, there is so much out there that we as humans, we are limited in terms of the data that we can process and that we can sift through. There's a set speed we can go at. Yes, okay, that varies a little bit between humans, but no human is able to sift through, that list of compounds at the same speed as a computer. If you're looking for new drugs, a computer is going to do that much faster than a human is. And that does present us with so many different opportunities. And you mentioned around the climate crisis there as well. And I think that's a really crucial thing to talk about, because this is a little bit of a double-edged sword when we start talking about AI and the climate crisis. Because on one hand, there are lots of things AI can help us do and discover to minimise the impacts of the climate crisis, and also to help solve that problem. But on the other hand, generally when you're running these programs, you're using incredibly power-intensive models, and generating emissions off the back of those models. So it is a little bit of a balancing act. Do you have any advice for people in terms of how they do that balancing? Because there is an environmental cost to running models.
Yeah. And I think it's about educating yourself and investigating what algorithm is used. Because if you're doing a search on a search engine, it may feel very similar to doing an inquiry on one of these generative AI models like a ChatGPT. It feels like the same process as a user. You've got a screen, you're typing in a question, but actually the algorithms are so radically different. And a lot of these modern algorithms are highly iterative, which means they're not only using data sets of millions and millions, hundreds of millions of data points, but they also have to go over those data sets millions of times while they're learning. And then each time you use it, it's got to go over that entire data set again. And it is radically different, the amount of energy needed and the amount of carbon produced for one type of algorithm compared to another. So unless you have educated yourself on what those different algorithms are doing and a little bit about how they're working, you can't tell the difference between a kind of a one and done, simple analytic process that you might have done when you were at university a long time ago, versus a modern algorithm that is filthy dirty sometimes. And we have to be open and honest and say we're solving problems, but we're also creating other issues.
And I think, one of the classic examples of that is, everybody is using ChatGPT to do their homework, write their PowerPoint presentations, write their, social media posts, etc. And I think we do need to start talking about the environmental cost of doing that versus doing it yourself. Because sometimes if you took the extra 5 minutes, you could have a much better impact on the environment rather than farming it off to a computer to solve it for you. Now, there are obviously situations where things get far more complicated, and there is a benefit, an overall benefit to getting a computer system to do that, right? But as you said, there's definitely a balancing act, and you do need to go and do that education and look at what models are being used. Because certainly some of them are better for energy consumption than others.
And if we start importing, for example, our search habits, which is all day, every day, looking up trivia, I do the same.
We all do it.
We don't want to import that habit into something like a ChatGPT. That would be a disaster. And that's a cultural issue that we have to take responsibility for and say, no, I've got alternative paths if I want to search trivia and rubbish, which I do sometimes.
We all do it, let's face it. So there is, as well as this shift in the workplace, we need to see this cultural shift as well in terms of how we interact with technology, and a little bit more thought and mindfulness going into that process rather than the mindless scroll or search that we typically tend to do now. So I think it is definitely going to be a big shift coming forwards, but it's a shift that needs to happen for sure. So going back to that workplace skill opportunity that there is available for people to make the most of, and employers also need to be making the most of this with their workforces. Aside from advising employees to take basic AI courses, is there anything that employers or companies as a whole can do to future-proof their workforce here?
Absolutely. I think acting now is the best thing. If you wait, you'll start to fall behind. I think there shouldn't be a panic. We have this idea that the technology just dictates the pace of change, but actually there's not a lot of evidence. People move, when they feel ready. And certainly, although we had a lot of hype around AI last year, we didn't have as much adoption as you might imagine. I think companies need to start working, if you're a large organization, at human resources level. We certainly at the Institute of Analytics, we are trying to work with human resource managers because they are the hub of employing these data scientists. And data science is a vast field. And this idea that you can get one data scientist who can do everything in the whole field is cruel. It's unreasonable. So it's part of the job is helping them to understand how to read a data science CV when they actually get their hands on one, make sure they're not making their lives miserable. And then we also, of course, then need to think about how we're going to culturally change, because going from a legacy system of doing things to having a machine on the team, here are all my humans and here's the machine. And the machine's got some insight and some ideas and some opinions that I need to take into account. I might reject them, I might accept them. Nevertheless, human-machine teaming is the way forwards. And I think companies do need to start accepting there's a major cultural shift. The CEO succeeded and excelled in legacy systems. And so perhaps there is also a big change needed at the top, which can be quite challenging, and start making that move, because we do know that actually there are huge efficiencies from upskilled staff. I think they can add around, 12, 15, 20% efficiencies. Therefore, companies, if they want to stay competitive, they do have to start making that shift as much as they don't want to. They have to start looking at what's happening in their field. And again, that's what we do a lot of just support through this extremely difficult phase. I understand the fear. I've been there. I've come through it. I think other organizations can as well.
It is definitely a big transition period that we're heading into with regards to needing to skill up employees and also, as you say, the structure of teams changing, leadership's changing. It is, I think...
And values changing, because like you said, the environment is suddenly becoming far more important. Companies are having to, by law, start reporting on their carbon. And so you've got to then also, you've got this far more human, in many ways, we've got far more human organizations today than we had, because we've got a different generation coming through. And we've got to be environmentally responsible, and we've got to deal with machines on the team. And it's a lot, but it's all heading in a really positive and good direction. And I think that's the thing to focus on.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good note to end this on, right? There is change coming, but it is really positive change. There's a world of opportunity out there. And we just need to make sure that as individuals and as companies, we're making the most of those opportunities that are coming up.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you very much for your time today, Claire. It's been super interesting talking to you. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, and we hope to see you again for our next episode. See you soon.